There's a corner of sleep that shouldn't be reached, a place beyond the usual turn of dreams where reality gets blurry, and things that don't belong start to creep in. I've always been a light sleeper, my mind awake even when my body rests. But about a month ago, something changed. Night after night, I was pulled deeper into a dream I couldn't shake off. It began innocently enough, lingering in that foggy area between sleep and waking. But then, bit by bit, a presence started to emerge, and I began to notice the man. The first time he appeared, he didn't even look at me. He was just a background figure, half hidden in the blur of a typical dreamscape, an old park I used to visit as a kid, the playground faintly lit by a dim street lamp. He was sitting on the edge of the swings, not swinging, not moving, just sitting there. I couldn't make out his features, his face was a smudge, something my mind couldn't focus on, like it wasn't meant to be seen. I forgot about him the next day, it was only a dream, after all. But then he came back, the next night, and the night after that. Each time, he grew a little closer. Each time, I noticed a little more detail, a shadow of a chin here, a glint of something like an eye there. It was as if he was waiting for me to see him, to recognize him. After a week, he was no longer a vague figure on the edge of the dream. He was part of it, woven into whatever scene my sleeping mind conjured up. And that's when the dreams began to change. They turned darker, stranger. No matter where I was in my dream, a beach, a forest, a street lined with unfamiliar houses, he'd be there, always waiting, always watching, just a little closer each time. I started avoiding sleep, telling myself I was just overworked, that I needed a break, that it was all stress and nothing more. But when I did finally sleep, he was there, waiting, closer than before. One night, about 2 weeks into these recurring dreams, I found myself in a dimly lit room I didn't recognize. There he was, sitting in a chair in the corner. This time, I could see him clearly, too clearly. His skin was the color of old parchment, thin and stretched tightly over a skull that seemed wrong. His face was almost human but not quite, like it had been molded from a memory, with details that didn't line up right. His eyes, or whatever lay in their place, were dark, empty voids that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. But the worst part was his smile. It was stretched too wide, too fixed, like it was carved into his face. I tried to wake up. I remember clawing at my own skin in the dream, trying to tear myself out of it, but I couldn't. He just sat there, watching, as though amused by my terror. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and for the first time in my life, I felt afraid to go back to sleep. Over the next few days, I tried everything, sleeping pills, staying up late, dosing myself with caffeine. Nothing worked. He was always there, waiting, lurking in the shadows of my mind, closer each time. And then, about 3 weeks in, he spoke. The dream was hazy, like a memory half forgotten. I was in the same park as the first dream, standing by the rusted swing set. He was there, sitting on the swing, his head tilted as he watched me. For the first time, I had the sinking feeling that he was waiting for me. "Do you know me?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, but wrong somehow, like it was just a mimicry of human speech. I froze. I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't move. His words hung in the air, thick and cold. "No," I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. He tilted his head, his smile stretching wider, his eyes dark and empty. "Not yet," he said. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and I swear I could still hear his voice, lingering in my ears like an echo. It felt too real, like he'd somehow reached out from the dream and left a part of himself behind. I was rattled. Days passed, and the fear began to bleed into my waking life. I felt his presence everywhere, in the creak of a door, in the flicker of shadows at dusk, in the silence that filled my apartment late at night. The line between waking and dreaming was blurring, and I couldn't tell which world he belonged to. One night, I had a friend over, desperate for some normalcy, hoping that maybe company would keep the nightmares away. We were sitting in the living room, chatting, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something behind me. "What?" I asked, turning around. There was nothing there, just the hallway leading to my bedroom. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head, though he looked pale. "I just thought I saw someone." "Never mind." The room went cold. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams. Part of me thought saying it out loud would make it worse, make it real. But my friend's reaction was enough to confirm what I'd been dreading. This wasn't just a figment of my imagination. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. At some point, I drifted off despite my best efforts to stay awake, and he was waiting for me. This time, I was back in the dim room. He was sitting across from me, and this time, he was closer than ever, so close I could see the fine, papery lines in his skin, the thin cracks that ran along his face like dry riverbeds. His eyes met mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones, like he was reaching inside me, taking root. "You're starting to understand," he said, his voice a soft whisper, almost gentle. What are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, smelling faintly of rot, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "You invited me," he said, his smile widening, "by looking for me." "I didn't," I started to protest, but he raised a finger, shushing me. "All those nights lying awake, thinking of me, wondering if I was real, that's how I got here. You opened the door. I'm here now, and there's no closing it." I woke up with a start, my chest tight, my hands trembling. For the first time, I felt like I was truly losing control. He was more than just a nightmare. He was something real. Something I'd somehow invited into my life. The following days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his presence, hovering just on the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to drift off. I was losing track of time, the days blurring into each other. I started to see him even when I was awake, in fleeting shadows, in the corner of my vision, in reflections that didn't seem quite right. I decided I needed help, someone who could make sense of what was happening to me. I contacted a sleep specialist, someone recommended by a friend. She listened patiently as I told her about the dreams, about the man, about the way he was creeping into my waking life. I expected her to tell me it was just stress, that I needed medication or therapy. But instead, she listened, her face growing pale. "You're not the first person to tell me this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There have been others." "Others?" I asked, a cold dread settling over me. She nodded. "They all described a man, someone who wasn't human, someone who invaded their dreams. They all said he got closer and closer, that he wanted something from them." "What happened to them?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked away, her hands trembling. "Most of them, they just disappeared. One by one. I stopped hearing from them. I don't know where they went." I left her office in a daze, her words echoing in my mind. He wasn't just a dream. He was something far worse, something that could reach out and pull people into, wherever he came from. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't let him take me. I wouldn't let him drag me into whatever nightmare he came from. I stayed up, drinking coffee, pacing the room, trying to keep myself awake. But no matter how hard I tried, exhaustion eventually claimed me, and I drifted off, sinking into a restless sleep. I found myself back in the dim room, and he was waiting for me, sitting across from me, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice soft, almost kind. "You're mine now. You've always been mine." I felt a surge of anger, a desperation to fight back. "What do you want from me?" He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver through my soul. You already know. I want you. I want your mind, your fear, your soul. I want you to remember me, to think of me, to let me in. I shook my head, trying to push him away, but he just laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed in the dark. You can't escape me, he whispered, his voice fading into the shadows. You let me in, and now I'm part of you. I woke up, gasping, my body trembling, the taste of fear thick in my mouth. I could feel him, still lingering in the back of my mind, a shadow I couldn't shake. He was there, waiting, always watching, a part of me now. And I knew, deep down, that he would never leave.